Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. Now I think you know the drill. If you're a YouTube viewer, please consider subscribing and hit that notification bell too. But did you know that you can also download this video and many others from my website in full HD resolution? Can I also remind you that I am not a business and there is a fair cost to maintain this site and create these videos. So if the videos do help you, a small PayPal donation would be great just to help me cover some of these costs. There's plenty of donate options on my website. With that advert out of the way, I think I can safely say that every one of us, and by us I mean photographers and probably more often than not amateur photographers, we're often inspired to raise the camera to our eye to capture a scene that may not be a stunning prize winner, but there was definitely something there that made us stop and capture the shot. When we look at these same shots as thumbnails sometime later, I think we often miss them because our attention is grabbed by the more contrasty and the more colourful thumbnails which may be featured in that batch. Even though we know that good images can sometimes be hiding inside a dull-looking raw file, we just get distracted by the more dramatic-looking thumbnails. It's a natural thing. Here we can see a few examples, but particularly the top line, the ones with the green labels, I'd like to draw your attention to. Now, when I looked at these just recently and they were mixed in with a large batch of different images, my first thought was, what possessed me to take that shot? Now, I'm almost certain that you've had exactly that same thought with your own images. Let's take a closer look at this shot to see if it's worth a few minutes manipulation in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. Remember, Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom are very much the same. It's the techniques that are important to us, not the software we're using. Now, the reasons that our thumbnails often don't match what we saw at the time is that firstly they were shot as raw images, and of course all raw images require editing to be seen at their best. But also our cameras can't capture what we see anyway, particularly with regard to the range of contrast in the picture. What we see at the time is not what we get. When I look at pictures like this on my computer, I try to look past what I'm actually seeing here to what I can create. I don't think there's a great deal of doubt that what inspired me to raise my camera to my eye was the way the light was catching the edge of the trees. Of course, the contrast didn't seem quite as high to me at the time. If we look up at the top right to the histogram and just below it, we can see that the settings that I used here are pretty basic and standard. Now, I would always start with what Photoshop 2020 now calls optics. If we go into the optics settings, we can tick the box to remove chromatic aberration. Now, chromatic aberration is that coloured fringing which we see around the edges of, maybe at the top of the trees there against the dark background on the right or on the left. Profile corrections, well, sometimes I tick them and sometimes I don't. It depends on how it affects the image. It really doesn't matter a great deal, but as I do so, you can see what happens. It picks up automatically the lens that I used and it applies any lens profiles to correct for any distortion. So sometimes when I tick the box, I don't like the effect too much, but here I don't think it makes any difference at all. So the next stop would be my basic tab. Now I have my Adobe Camera Raw set up here so that when I click into the Basic tab, then the optics will automatically close. I quite like that setting. If you want to look at the settings for how these panels open and close, go to the top right of the screen to the little cogwheel. Click that and the camera raw preferences will open up. In the General tab at the top, you can see I've got an option selected called Single, and we do get told exactly what it'll do. Only one edit panel will open at a time. So as I select another panel, the one I'm working on closes down. That's what I quite like. But there are two others in here. If you come into here and select them, you'll get a description of exactly what they do. Now we can often be guided on what we do next by looking at the histogram. If we do, we can see the histogram at the top right is looking pretty healthy. If I mouse over this, you can see a number of shaded areas, and just below my cursor you can see that the word there is exposure. If I move to the right, you can see we're now looking at the highlights in the image, and they're pretty good. And if I go to the extreme right, we're looking at the whites, and they're pretty good too. I've got the clipping warnings turned on for both the highlights and the shadows over on the left here, and we're not seeing any problems with the exposure. Going to the left from the exposure setting there, we've got the shadows, which are pretty good, but we do have a deficiency in the blacks. Can you see a gap between the bottom of the histogram just there to the edge? So there's a place we could make a start by going down to the black slider here and dragging that to the left while we're looking at both the histogram and also the image. Now what you may find when you're dealing with shadows, blacks, whites and highlights, our eye seems to be able to cope better with blocked up shadows than it can with burnt out highlights. So we can sometimes push the shadows and the blacks and the contrast maybe a little bit higher than we would the highlights. That's certainly the experience that I've found. But you can see now by dragging down that blacks, the histogram looks a lot better. I'm not losing any detail. You can see if I go a little bit more to the left, look up at the top right, you can see a little fine line appear at the bottom left corner of the histogram, and the clipping warning lights up. But I have to go quite a long way before we start to see any colour evidence of that on the image. So I think I've got quite a bit of latitude here, and I certainly would take the blacks way down to something like that. What's the setting? -56, but not really relevant. All images are going to be different. The next deficiency in this image I would suggest is the colour. So if I push the vibrance up, we can see the greens are coming through lovely, but as I start to push it, there's an obvious problem there. And it's something that I see quite a bit in images, particularly with camera clubs. Now that's not right, and it's certainly not the natural colour. And it's really telling me that what I need to do here is adjust the colour balance. Now to do that, I'm going to go to my white balance tool. If we go to the top of the Basic tab, there it is, tucked away over on the right hand side. I'm going to select that. I'm going to go into that top right corner, and I'm just going to look for an area that I think should be neutral in colour. I'm going to just click into the blue there and look at the difference that makes. I can try clicking on the trees in the centre, and it doesn't really do a great deal of difference. Whether I click in the centre of the frame or at the top right, we're getting a very good result when it comes to colour. Now the good thing about this, of course, is if it looks good, we can just accept it and move on. But if we think it's a little too warm, then we can just tweak the temperature down a little bit, and there's always lots of personal choice here. But we've got weakness in the top right of the image, the top left and down the edge a little bit over on that left hand side, and certainly the bottom of the image needs our attention. But we can deal with those one step at a time. But I would like to squeeze just a little bit more impact into the overall image first, and I think I'll drop down to my exposure for that. Just going to drop that exposure down. I'm darkening the shadows here in the center of the frame, but I can still see detail in amongst the trees, so I'm reasonably happy with that. Now let's take a look at the top of the image using a graduated filter. I'll select the filter, I'll click and drag from the top of the screen downwards. Remember, we can move any of these pins around. I can drag this down, which means that any change I make will be certainly solid from the very top halfway down this graduated filter. But I think I'll make some changes before I move any of these around, because generally speaking, if we drag down from the top to around about there, if we're trying to deal with this area in general, it's probably going to be enough. It's just my personal thing that I like to get these bounding boxes out of the way when I'm making my manipulations, so I always touch the V key. So it just hides that selection, but it's still there and it's still working. So if I go to my exposure slider, I'm just going to drop the exposure down in the top of the image. Now I can see the effect of what I'm doing. I'm going to touch the V key again, because I think I can come down a little further with this, and maybe just touch the V again and just back off a little bit. The one good thing about graduated filters, any of the tools which we use to make strategic changes, we can add one on top of another. So if I wanted a slightly more intense look in the top right, I could select my adjustment brush, or I could create a new graduated filter for that top right corner. Now let me touch the V key to bring the selection back. And I think what I may do at the top right is to select the adjustment brush. I'll do much the same as I did with the gradient filter or the graduated filter. I'm going to drop the exposure down, but using a nice soft brush, I'm just going to brush into that area just to knock the density down nicely. And while I've got the brush, I'm going to have a go at the top left. Now you can see some of that clipping warning coming in these little areas. Not a problem. It really isn't, not on the edge. So don't worry too much. And in fact, I'll turn them off so they don't distract us too much, because we want it quite dark on that left, and I may even just give a wipe here and there where I think the image is weak. Just in one or two small places, little touch more at the top right corner, but then I think it needs a little bit of a stand back and make sure we're on the right track. Definitely the next thing we need to look at is the base of the image. Now I think the base of this image is perfect for the graduated filter, so let's reselect that from the top right. You'll notice the original one is now greyed out, but we can bring that back with just a click on the pin, of course. So if we wanted to adjust that, if we wanted to bring it down further or make any changes, we can do that, of course. If you want to rotate your selection, I find it's a little bit easier if you move away from the center of the frame. It becomes just a little bit more controllable rather than trying to pivot things from the center. But back to the base here. I'm going to click at the base and drag my selection up. And what I want to do here is to give a fair amount of change. It's picking up the last change that I included with the exposure. So I think let's have a look at bringing down the highlights, taking down the exposure even a little more in that area. Because if we look at the top of the image is fairly dark. We're not going to be able to get the base quite that dark. I think it'll look a little bit odd. But if we have the base as dark as we can get away with, it does offer an overall balance between the top and the bottom. So what can we squeeze in here? Let's have a look at some blacks. That does a nice job and brings in a bit of colour too. That's not looking too bad at all. Now it's at this point where I would like to have just a couple of minutes time out and just decide if and when or what I want to do next. Now to do that, I sometimes open my image up into Photoshop. I'm not sure why, and there's no real need to do this. It's just a little quirk of my own. But if I click to open the object, it'll open up in Photoshop. But I'm opening this up as a smart object. And what that means is I can double click my thumbnail and go straight back into Camera Raw when I've had 5 minutes to look at the image, maybe walk away if I can, and come back in a few moments time. I'd like to do a little bit of darkening to the foliage on the right hand side, just a little bit, because we've got a dark left hand side, maybe a little darken in there. But then I think I'll open it back up into Photoshop and do a little bit of lightening of the highlights. Well, you'll see in a few seconds. So first up, let's double click the thumbnail at the top right and it'll reopen exactly where we left it in Adobe Camera Raw. If you'd like to turn on the Smart Object status from within Adobe Camera Raw, go down to the center base of the screen and click the hyperlink. The option you want is this little box here. Tick the box and it'll open in Photoshop as a smart object. That tick will remain there until you decide to remove it. So it's not just this image, it's all images, and it's very quick and easy to move away from the smart object status when we need to within the main window of Photoshop. So I'd like to darken down the right hand side from about the top of the tree line down around this area. So I'm going to just click and drag to get that large on the screen. Touch the space bar and you can move the image around. I'm going to select my adjustment brush, and from the options I'm going to drop the exposure and the highlights, and I'm just going to use a nice big soft brush to just darken down that edge just a little bit. Now you'll notice that I'm not having a massive effect here, but that's not the point of the exercise. Little steps which, when we add them up, of course they turn into quite large ones. So I just want to darken that edge, and I think that's probably going to be as much as I need. I can return my image to the screen with Control 0. So I'm going to have one last look around, but I think I'm reasonably happy with that. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to click the OK button down at the bottom right. You may notice that previously we had a button there which says Open Object, but of course we've already done that. So now we just get an OK button because all we're doing is updating our smart object. So let's go to the OK button and we'll open this up into Photoshop. There is a couple of little touches I'd like to do. A little bit of selective colour, a little bit of selected dodging and burning, maybe more dodging rather than burning, and maybe just the odd touch of the healing brush. The problem I have now is I'm working on a smart object, albeit that most of the work's been done. But to move forward with what I want to do, I cannot do that on a smart object. Let me explain by going to the toolbox on the left, and for example, let me pick up the Dodge tool. And when I do, I get a little symbol that says, no, you cannot do this. It means I've got to change the status of my image from a smart object to a standard layer. Or what I could do is keep the smart object up my sleeve by making a copy. If I hit Ctrl J, for example, and go to the right of the thumbnail, right click and choose Rasterize, now for the moment I've got the best of both worlds. I can proceed with the rest of the changes on this layer, knowing that if I go up the wrong street or avenue and I want to back away from that, I've got the original sitting here. And of course, if we save this as a Photoshop file, not only do we have the rasterized layer, but I still have access back into Adobe Camera Raw. So now we're working on a standard layer. If I bring my brush to the top right of the screen, you can see now it's fully working. I need to make my brush maybe just a little bit bigger, but not much. And I want to go to the top of the screen over on the left because the options I want to dodge are the highlights. In actual fact, I want to make the edge just a little bit brighter. And I need an exposure of something like 5 or 10%. With this little icon checked, I've just hit the number 1 key and it will automatically jump to 10%. Now you can make your image a lot bigger if you wish. I'll try to keep mine as it is. I'm just going to lift the edges of that light. Now we don't have to be too careful here. It's quite forgiving on what we're doing. And we don't have to be too specific about it. As you can see, I'm just dodging around. I like the light up here, so I'm going to make a bit of a feature of that and along the edge there. And any area that I feel is going to lift my image just a little bit. You can hardly see a change being made. But when I go to this layer and turn it off, you can see what I've actually done. Now, as always, how much we do is going to be a personal choice. The other thing I'd like to do is just a little bit of selective colour. Once again, I think we could probably work with the image as it is, but I'll just zoom in a little bit. I'm going to go back to the same tool, but click and hold to pick up the sponge tool. And the mode I want to select at the top of the screen is saturate. And the flow of 20%, well, I'll see if that's going to be okay or not. I just want to do a little bit of saturation of the warm colours and those colours that are really standing out against the background. There's some reds coming through those plants there, which I want to make a little more of. And I'll move across and do a little bit here. Once again, we're not doing massive amounts. And the work is very forgiving because we're largely against the dark background and we're not affecting other colours. But I'm gradually just lifting all of the reds, moving over to the right hand side here. I seem to have a little bit of movement in the plants there, but it doesn't seem to be affecting the image. It gives this a nice base. That's the sort of thing I was thinking about, and there may be 1 or 2 areas I need to look at, but eventually I'll hit Ctrl-0 and fit the image back on screen. And finally, just a little bit of work with the spot healing brush. Now I think I've got a better idea of what it was on that particular day which made me raise my camera to my eye. If I move up to that rasterized layer and just temporarily turn off the little eye, you can see the difference between the work we did in Camera Raw and the few final touches we did in Photoshop. So this is often the fun part of a manipulation. When we bring up on screen the image we started with, no changes made to this particular version at all, and then we allow it to just jump instantly to the image we've created, and we can see the difference. Now as I switch back to the original image again, if we just think about what's causing the gap between this and the image we've created, well, it's partly to do with the fact that we're shooting RAW, and all RAW files need a fair degree of manipulation. There's the fact that in contrasty situations, the image as we saw it isn't recorded in the same way on our camera. There's a degree of exposing to the right here a little bit, where I've squeezed quite a bit of light into this shot so that I don't have to do too much with the shadows, and probably a little bit to do with the way or the angle of the light on the picture. I'll see you next time.